I'm Jess and you're watching I'm Just Saying, or Just Saying, or hashtag Just Saying. I'm not 100% sure. It's the title of my show that I suggested and I don't know what it is. I do know that we're trying to do like a loose unit, like an unhinged, problematic fave Australian edition for every single one of these. And well, the first one I didn't say anything. The second one I might have said something. It depends if it made it in all my rambling of trying to tell you about Elden Ring that poor Dan has to piece together. But in this one, I'm going to tell you right up at the top. The loose unit for today's video is Cyberpunk 2077, which came out loose as f***, so unhinged, it had no hinges. No hinges, all bugs, no waiting. What a f***ing mess. This is not what we were sold. But what do we have now? One of the greatest RPGs of all time. And on today's I'm Just Saying, which, let me be clear, another alternate title is 33-year-old woman yells at cloud. It's just my 1 cent. 2 cents feels generous. This is my 1 cent. On today's episode, we're talking about why, while there will undoubtedly be more loose units, there will never be another Cyberpunk 2077. Is that extreme? Yes. Kind of. It doesn't mean there won't be more Cyberpunk 2077, and it doesn't mean that there will never be a game as good as this one again, or that's anything like it. What it does mean is that I think the industry is going in a really disturbing direction. I've sort of injected my thoughts about this here and there in other WhatCulture videos, but I think it's kind of terrifying right now that the fail fast mentality is becoming king. Not even fail fast. Some of these studios and games are being shut down before they even have a chance to fail. While CEOs are taking home more money than they ever have in the industry, layoffs are rampant, studio closures are rampant, and it's getting kind of terrifying. And my point is going to be how I think that connects to a game like Cyberpunk 2077, most significantly, the post-launch experience of Cyberpunk 2077. I feel like in 2024, if we got Cyberpunk 2077 now, and maybe if it was from any other studio other than CD Projekt Red, but even then, who knows? There's no way that game is being lovingly taken care of and turned over and fixed up and tweaked for as long as it was to turn into the experience it did. There is such a mentality now that game studios cannot lose. There is too much money behind it. There is too many decision makers who are not probably in the, creative spectrum, but are rather in the money-making spectrum, where it isn't about playing around with ideas and making mistakes and learning from them. And boy, do you learn a lot when you release a game like Cyberpunk 2077 in its first state, like No Man's Sky in its first state, like Final Fantasy XIV, which was an absolute flop when it came out and is now one of the greatest MMOs of all time, one of the greatest RPGs of all time. I don't think that that's going to happen anymore. I think the industry seems to be headed in a direction with the closure of, for example, Arcane Austin for releasing Redfall. Yeah, Redfall wasn't a good game. Okay, it was a pretty average experience, but does that mean that the studio who was also responsible for a bunch of fantastic experiences that, came from Arcane or contributed towards those experiences in whatever capacity that studio did should just be sledged and not given the opportunity to work at it again? I mean, you look at the number of trilogies that we've seen come out, the number of, I've mentioned it in the first video, but a game like Dragon Age 2. What if BioWare had just shut down after Dragon Age 2? After some people came back and were like, this one's okay, maybe not this one. Then what, it just stops? The number of studios that have had misfires and have gone on to release some straight up 10 out of 10, some of the greatest video games ever made. The list is probably every single game studio ever. Because even the ones who nail it all the time don't nail it every time. These studios should be able to release a game that's not a slam dunk and continue to function and learn from those mistakes. It seems like we're heading in a direction where if they can't get it in one try right out the gate, then best case scenario, they lose budget and probably experience layoffs. And worst case scenario, the entire studio is shut down. It doesn't seem like there are many studios left that would lovingly put a year or two or whatever the case was for the games I've mentioned, Cyberpunk, Final Fantasy XIV, No Man's Sky, Rainbow Six Siege, games that ended up being fantastic but just needed the love and care to get all the way there. I'm not sure that's something that's going to happen anymore. Square put themselves into the red so they could turn Final Fantasy XIV from a massively disappointing experience into a total overhaul that created one of the greatest MMOs that are still being played today. Cyberpunk 2077 was the same. It experienced an enormous, complete game-long overhaul. So did No Man's Sky. And they were so much the better for it. And now we have them in the state in which the developers intended, the studio had hoped, because they had the backing of, in Cyberpunk's case, CD Projekt Red, of Square, for Rainbow Six Siege, of Ubisoft. But those examples are becoming fewer and fewer. You can't help but wonder if a game came out now that just wasn't quite all the way there but had really strong bones, would anyone actually give it the chance to turn into the game that it could have been? Would it be given the year of extra funding? Would it be allowed to keep its staff on to keep working on the game and create something masterful? Or would it just be abandoned and just said to be a failure, and that would just then be its history? It seems negative to say that it's never going to be possible to have another Cyberpunk 2077, but certainly as the years wear on and we see this disturbing trend in the industry, it does seem less and less and less likely. I mean, Ubisoft brought out the new Prince of Persia game, which was a really interesting Metroidvania spin. It was really well received. It did really interesting things with the original IP and within the Metroidvania genre. And then they announced that there were layoffs in the team so that they could facilitate the upcoming content for the game, which seems to be such a trend. These companies keep announcing we had to let people go so we can keep making the content. But the people making the content, aren't they? I'm not a business person. I'm not a businesswoman. I do not know business things. But it just feels like the math isn't mathing. The most current example is it's been kind of interesting seeing how Bethesda is dealing with Fallout 76 and Starfield, a couple of games that launched very wobbly out the gate, but have not been abandoned in either aspect. But it's been interesting seeing how much is being done to see if they can get them into a state that would, you know, replicate the rags to riches state of a game like No Man's Sky or Cyberpunk 2077. Whether they can actually reach that is a different conversation, and one I might investigate a little bit in another video if you're interested. But it feels like Bethesda might be one of the few studios left standing that is willing to put the time and effort in to lovingly take a game and continue to tweak it and turn things around and make it more of what consumers were looking for from the outset. I feel like we get way more stories about these studios like dumping future content plans, dumping the end of what was going to be video game series or sequels, or closing the studios altogether. These hero stories, and probably why I keep mentioning the same games over and over again when I keep talking about the games that did get recovered after a year or two, they're few and far between. They already were few and far between over the last 10 years, and they're certainly not getting any more frequent. Let me know what you think. Is this a dire future trend that we're just going to see in the video game industry and nothing's going to change? Or do you think the love that eventually arrived for these experiences like Cyberpunk, like Final Fantasy XIV, is that going to be enough for studios to see that they can continue to put love and care into these experiences that have good enough bones that they can be built on and become something really magnificent. I want to be optimistic. I'm concerned. I'm gonna say my takeaway, I'm concerned. That's my nervous laughter of concern. Let me know what you think. I'd be really interested. I always appreciate reading your comments. Let's have a chat about it. I like these opportunities to have a discussion with you about some thoughts I'm having about video games or the industry. So I really hope you're enjoying them as much as I enjoy making them for you. And thank you for hanging out with me.